The Peregrine shouldn't be here. Not after 15 years. Not after the search teams combed the edges of the solar system and found nothing but empty void. It had been declared lost, filed away in aerospace records as another tragedy of deep space travel, a cautionary tale for future explorers. But it was here. Hanging motionless in high orbit over Earth's exo-recovery zone, its hull untouched, its communications silent, its crew unresponsive. I stood in Observation Chamber 3, staring at the real-time telemetry from the ship's outer plating. It was perfect. Too perfect. No micrometeoroid scarring. No surface erosion from cosmic radiation. No thermal degradation. 15 years in deep space should have left marks. But the Peregrine had returned as if it had never left. I checked the timestamps again. Launched 2073. Declared lost 2075. Returned 2153. That wasn't right? I tapped my fingers against the console, watching the motionless ship through the external cameras. A technician had joked in the briefing room that it was like seeing a coffin dug up only to find the body inside still breathing. No one had laughed. My name is Elias Mercer, and I work for the Aerospace Anomaly Investigation Bureau, AAB. We don't handle routine disasters. We don't analyze mechanical failures or fuel miscalculations. We handle everything else. The cases that defy logic, the telemetry anomalies that contradict physics, the ghost ships that come back when they shouldn't. That's why I was here. Inside quarantine control, 500 kilometers above Earth, watching a ship that shouldn't exist prepare for its first human contact in decades. The Peregrine's crew, or at least what was left of it, was currently en route to the station via a controlled docking sequence. They were sealed in reinforced decontamination pods, monitored by every biometric scanner we had, because the first thing the flight surgeon noticed was that their DNA signatures weren't exact matches. They were close. Close enough that a casual scan might not flag the discrepancy. Close enough that a casual eye might never notice. But this wasn't a casual investigation. The Peregrine had been missing for 15 years, and its crew had returned insisting only 39 days had passed for them. There was a knock against the glass. Dr. Harlan Reese stood on the other side, arms crossed, his face tight with exhaustion. Reese was the lead researcher in temporal displacement studies, a field that had gained far too much interest since the ship's reappearance. "They're ready," he said. I exhaled slowly, centering my thoughts. Then I stepped into the decontamination corridor. I had seen photos of the Peregrine's crew before launch. High-resolution mission stills, pre-flight psychological evaluations, training footage. I had memorized their faces. The men and women sitting before me were those people, but not exactly. Their posture was too rigid. Their uniforms, pulled from the ship's supply lockers, looked untouched, as if they'd never been worn. Their expressions held something unnerving. Not blank, not emotionless, but practiced, rehearsed. Captain Gabriel Harlow was the first to speak. "Good to see Earth again, gentlemen." Reese and I exchanged a glance. I took the lead. "Captain Harlow, my name is Elias Mercer. I'm overseeing forensic analysis on the Peregrine's return." I studied his face carefully. "Do you understand why you and your crew are under extended quarantine?" Harlow nodded. "Protocol, ensuring no biological contamination, no psychological degradation due to prolonged deep space exposure." His voice was measured, controlled, confident. "We expected as much." I tapped the edge of my tablet, choosing my words carefully. "You filed a distress signal before your disappearance. The final telemetry showed a sudden propulsion failure, followed by a total loss of communications. Then nothing. We searched for 10 years before terminating recovery efforts. Now you're here, 78 years later. Do you understand how that looks?" Harlow didn't blink. "It looks impossible." His voice was steady. Too steady. "Then tell me," I said. "What do you remember?" Harlow glanced at his crew. Then, as if on cue, they all nodded at the exact same time. The moment stretched a fraction too long. Just enough for the back of my neck to prickle. Harlow exhaled. 39 days, Mercer. That's how long it's been for us. We conducted standard deep space navigational tests. We encountered an anomaly during a routine trajectory adjustment. And then, he hesitated. For exactly 1 second. Then we were here. His tone was casual. Certain. He believed what he was saying. I switched tactics. What's the last thing you remember before arrival? Harlow's expression didn't flicker. Running standard system diagnostics. No malfunctions. No warnings. No indication anything was wrong. I watched him carefully. Then why did your distress signal indicate a total propulsion failure? Harlow's gaze didn't waver. That must be an error. There was a quiet chime behind me. A biometric alert. Reese stiffened. Hold on. He turned to the medical monitors. Your medical scans just updated. The screen beside us displayed real-time physiological data. Harlow's readout was fluctuating. Reese leaned forward, studying the feed. Your blood chemistry just shifted mid-test. Harlow blinked at him. His crew sat perfectly still. That's impossible, he said. Reese's face tightened. His biometric feed was wrong. His blood oxygen levels were cycling through a precise rhythmic pattern as if following an unseen algorithm rather than random biological variants. His heart rate held steady for exactly 50 seconds before adjusting by 2 beats per minute, then reversing the change at the same interval. Even his body temperature fluctuated by a precise 1/10 of a degree every 90 seconds. A level of consistency that had no biological explanation. I studied Harlow. No sweat, no rapid breathing, no sign of distress. Reese exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. Your resting BPM at launch was 64. It's 61 now. Minor variance, sure, but your plasma protein levels have dropped by 5.8%. There is no natural physiological condition that would induce those changes over a 4-week period. Harlow remained still. And yet here I am. I pushed my chair back slightly. You understand how this looks, Captain? Of course. He didn't even hesitate. Didn't even attempt to explain the discrepancies. Then Harlow smiled. Not a full smile. Just a fractional shift at the corner of his mouth. A micro-expression. Something added for effect. A gesture meant to be understood. I pushed my chair back fully. We need further analysis before we clear you for reintegration. Harlow's half-smile didn't change. Of course. Not one of them protested. And that's when I knew. They were cooperating too much. 2 hours later, I was inside Quarantine Research Bay 2 reviewing the Peregrine's telemetry scans. The ship had been moved into a containment docking platform outside the station where it would remain sealed off until we determined the nature of its disappearance. Dr. Reese stood beside me, arms crossed, staring at the materials analysis report with an expression caught between frustration and disbelief. This can't be right. Which part? I asked. Reese let out a sharp breath. All of it. He flicked his hand toward my monitor. The hull composition is off by less than 1%. But it's off. Alloy density is heavier than at launch. Bulkhead measurements are misaligned by margins too small for human error. Even the internal structures have atomic inconsistencies. The ship is the same, I murmured. But it isn't. Reese ran a hand over his face. You think it was reconstructed? His jaw tightened. I think it was copied. I closed my eyes for a moment. The mass discrepancy was small. Barely enough to be noticed under conventional analysis. But mass doesn't just increase without an external variable. The Peregrine had come back heavier than when it left. And now we had biological and structural deviations. Something had changed. Not just the crew. The ship itself. I straightened and tapped into the next file. Interior mapping scans. At a glance, the Peregrine's layout was exactly as recorded. Crew compartments. Bridge. Medbay. Engineering. The AI flagged no deviations in basic structure. But there was one inconsistency. Reese. I turned the monitor toward him. There's a sealed section in the cargo bay. He leaned in, frowning. How sealed? Airlocked. Command overrides don't respond. The ship's security protocols locked it from the inside. But the crew insists it was always like that. Reese's fingers drummed against the counter. That's not standard procedure. No, I agreed. It isn't. 30 minutes later, I was standing inside the Peregrine's airlock chamber, sealed inside a containment suit. The external diagnostics registered no airborne contaminants, no chemical irregularities, no unexpected radiation sources. But the ship still felt wrong. Not in a way the sensors could quantify. The atmospheric pressure was normal, but sound carried strangely through my suit's external pickups. Muted in some places, oddly amplified in others. The air was still. Yet the moment I stepped inside, there was a sensation. Not something I was feeling. Something I wasn't feeling. Like stepping into a room that should be full of ambient noise but registers as sterile silence instead. like being in a space that had been meticulously erased, rather than merely cleaned. Reese stood beside me, his face obscured behind his visor. "You sure we don't need a full decontamination cycle?" I checked my scanner. Readings are clear. If something's in here, it isn't biological. He didn't look comforted. The sealed cargo bay was at the far end of the ship, beyond the main supply holds. As we moved through the corridors, I noticed something. The bulkheads were subtly mismatched. Not enough to notice at a glance. But once I'd seen it in the scans, I couldn't unsee it. The ship's structure had been altered. At an atomic level, Reese reached the control panel first. He ran an override command. The security locks responded a fraction of a second slower than they should have, as if something was processing the request before allowing it. Then the bay doors slid open, and inside, in perfect symmetrical rows, were hundreds of cocoon-like structures. Some were smooth, others looked partially fractured, revealing something underneath that I couldn't quite comprehend at a glance. Reese swallowed. "Jesus!" I turned toward him, and as I did, the cocoon closest to us shifted. Not moving, not growing, just adjusting, as if it had just recognized us. Reese took a half step back, his breath audible in my earpiece. My suit's external air pressure sensors registered no movement in the room beyond our own. No external shifts, but I had seen it. The cocoon had adjusted itself. Not growing, not unfurling, but reacting. Reese's voice crackled through my comms. "Are we supposed to pretend we didn't see that?" "No," I adjusted my visor scanner overlay, running an immediate molecular analysis on the nearest structure. "But we're also not going to jump to conclusions before we have data." His breath steadied, his training kicking in over his nerves. "Composition, organic, protein-based, fibrous, some biopolymer integration. Not quite keratin, not quite chitin. No known analogs in human physiology." Reese crouched beside another cocoon. His containment gloves hovered just above its surface. Surface readings show no microbial presence, no external degradation. These should have biological byproducts. Even synthetic polymers develop trace environmental alterations. But these were pristine. I flexed my jaw. Like the ship? Reese didn't respond immediately. I could hear the tension in his breath. "We need to take a sample." He was right, but the moment I considered it, something in my mind hesitated. Like a survival instinct engaging at the last second before stepping somewhere I shouldn't. I ignored it. I wasn't about to let some atavistic paranoia keep me from getting the answers we needed. I set my equipment case on the deck, disengaged the sterilized containment field, removed a precision biopsy tool, an instrument designed for non-invasive sample extraction. We had protocols for handling unknown biological matter. The tool activated with a low vibration, its molecular blade calibrated for micron-thin tissue extraction. I adjusted the settings, set the extraction field to minimum incursion, and then I placed the instrument against the outer membrane of the cocoon. The moment it made contact, the ship responded. Not the cocoon, the ship itself. The deck beneath my boots shifted. Not physically, but in a way my body struggled to process. Like I had stepped somewhere else entirely for a fraction of a second. Then returned. My suit's telemetry flashed. All readings spiked out of expected variance for exactly 1.4 seconds. Reese stumbled back, his suit stabilizers compensating too slowly. What the hell was that? I exhaled carefully, watching the cocoon. It hadn't changed. No movement, no outward reaction. But I knew better. It wasn't unaware. It was waiting. The cocoon remained still, but it was watching. Not in the way a living thing watches, not with eyes or attention, but with an awareness that existed outside the bounds of simple observation. Something about the ship had changed the moment I touched that cocoon. Or maybe it had only revealed what had always been here. A warning hum reverberated through my suit's sensors. Reese's breathing had grown shallow. He felt it too. I turned to him, keeping my voice even. "We need to go." He didn't argue. We moved fast, exiting the cargo bay, passing rows of silent consoles and empty crew quarters that felt untouched, like no human had ever truly lived in them. But the air inside the Peregrine felt heavier now, as if something was pressing down on us, as if the ship was holding its breath. By the time we reached the quarantine debriefing chambers, I knew something was wrong. The reinforced observation glass was meant to separate the station's personnel from the Peregrine's crew. The chamber was pressurized, climate-controlled, and soundproof. But the crew wasn't speaking. They were just standing there, perfectly still, unblinking, unmoving, lined up in meticulous symmetry. Captain Harlow stood at the front, hands clasped behind his back. He stared straight ahead, his expression neutral. But his jaw was slightly too tight, like someone concentrating a little too hard on the act of looking normal. Rhys swallowed. They haven't moved since we left them. I stepped closer to the glass. Something was off about their posture. The way their shoulders were squared. The way their hands rested. Too stiff. Too precise. Like actors on a stage waiting for their cue. And then Harlow turned his head toward me. Not a normal movement. Not the way a person shifts their gaze. It was slow. Mechanical. As if he had only just realized we were there. Then all of them turned at once. Rhys exhaled sharply. Jesus. Their eyes settled on us. Not with curiosity. Not with relief. Just expectation. Harlow's lips parted. And when he spoke, it was wrong. Are we ready to go home? The sound carried strangely through the room. The acoustics felt off. Like the words weren't coming from his mouth, but from somewhere else. I gritted my teeth. We're still reviewing your return, Captain. We need more time. Harlow didn't blink. Neither did his crew. Rhys tapped on the biometric scanner. Their vitals are fluctuating again. I turned to check the monitor. Harlow's heart rate had dropped to a perfect 40 BPM. The crew's oxygen levels were cycling in unison, like synchronized waves. Their body temperatures were adjusting, not randomly, rhythmically. Then Harlow smiled. A fraction too late, a fraction too perfect. Like someone who had studied the act of smiling but never quite mastered it. I felt something deep in my gut. An instinct older than language. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. I stepped back from the glass. Something is changing. Rhys's fingers clenched. They're still adjusting. Harlow's head tilted slightly. You look uneasy. Rhys sucked in a breath. That's not how he talks. I checked the files. We had hours of pre-launch recordings of the crew. Harlow's speech was always deliberate, always measured. But this was off. Smoother than before. As if something had corrected a previous error. I forced my voice to remain neutral. Captain, what's the last thing you remember before arriving here? Harlow's smile didn't change, but his response was immediate. 39 days. Deep space navigational tests. We encountered a gravitational anomaly. Then we were here. I nodded slowly. You already told us that. His expression didn't shift. Then he spoke again. In the exact same tone. The same phrasing. The exact same pauses. 39 days. Deep space navigational tests. We encountered a gravitational anomaly. Then we were here. Rhys took a step back. They're repeating. The air felt thicker now. Harlow blinked once. Then, for the first time, his expression changed. Something behind his eyes cracked, like a fractured pane of glass, barely holding. And then his voice came from the walls. Not just his voice, all of theirs, at once. If you found us, then we have always been here. Harlow jerked forward. Not a step, just a motion, as if something inside him had tried to move before his body had time to catch up. Then the seam split, right down the center of his chest. His ribcage folded outward, peeling apart like wet paper. And inside there was nothing. No organs, no bones, just a hollow shape stretching and twisting, like something unfinished, like something not yet complete. Then the rest of them followed. Their skin peeled away, unfolding in slow, wet ribbons. Their eyes sank too deep into their skulls. Their jaws lengthened. Their torsos stretched apart like an open doorway leading somewhere else. And yet they spoke, not from their mouths, not from their bodies. The words rippled through the station, through the metal, through the air, through us. You were always meant to be. Rhys screamed, but I could barely hear him because the walls were dissolving. The station was coming apart. Not physically, but conceptually. Reality itself was rearranging around them, or maybe it had never been solid to begin with. Rhys's hand grasped my wrist. His fingers were bending wrong, shifting, rearranging themselves. I turned and he wasn't Rhys anymore. His ribcage had begun to open. His mouth had begun to unform. His eyes too wide. His voice not his own. Elias. I staggered back. My own fingers twitched. Something pressed against my skull. An idea that wasn't mine. trying to make space for itself. My legs locked. My breath stopped. Because something was already inside me. Rewriting me. Correcting me. And then I wasn't Elias Mercer anymore. The Peregrine shouldn't be here. Not after 78 years. But it was here. Waiting. And now we were ready to go home.